Welcome to History That Doesn't Suck. I'm your professor, Greg Jackson, and I'd like to tell you a story. It's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon of June 17th, 1775. Hundreds of Patriot militia are fortified on two hills of the Charlestown Peninsula, which sits just north of Boston across the Charles River. Militia from Connecticut and New Hampshire are behind a stone and rail fence just north of Breed's Hill, but below Bunker Hill. A small group of 150 are fortified in an earthen dugout fort, called a redoubt, up on Breed's Hill itself. All of them wait as the redcoats approach. Don't throw away a single shot, but take good aim, nor touch a trigger till you can see the whites of their eyes, legend tells us Patriot General Israel Putnam orders his men. But as awesome as that line sounds, alas, we have no proof of anyone saying the, by then, already well-known and existing phrase. So side note, if you go here today and visit the Bunker Hill Monument and its museum, the plaque on which this phrase is boldly inscribed isn't necessarily wrong. We just can't verify it. Now, that said, the sentiment is dead on. To return to the story, a Patriot colonel at the fence named John Stark commands his men to hold their fire until they can see the redcoats' quote, half-gaiters, which is a covering worn by the redcoats on their shins. Meanwhile, another Patriot leader, and arguably the man of the day, Colonel William Prescott, makes his men at the redoubt hold their fire until the redcoats are insanely close as well. At least 50 yards, and by some accounts as close as 10. So whether they're actually saying whites of their eyes or not, it's the same idea. The Patriots will let the redcoats get so close, even their less than accurate 18th century muskets can't miss. These Patriots won't throw away their shot. Fire! The ill-equipped Americans unleash an explosion of muskets. The wide, 3-man-deep, oblong lines of soldiers drop like flies. In one instance, the first line of soldiers falls dead and wounded into the second line, while a second close-range volley fired by the Patriots further decimates and repulses His Majesty's troops. After retreating and getting their men out of the Patriots' close range, the British General William Howe and Brigadier General Robert Pigot prepare to lead a second assault. These brave souls march in the same oblong formation. Pigots go back up the tall, grass-covered steep hill. Howe's head toward the stone and rail fence. As they advance, the cries of their wounded and dying comrades get louder and louder. Finally, the soldiers have to step over the bodies of their dead and wounded friends. But then, fire! This second charge proves no more effective than the first. The Patriots' up-close volley rips the redcoats to shreds. One Englishman figured most of the grenadiers and light infantry, quote, lost 3/4 and many 9/10 of their men. Some had only 8 or 9 men a company left. Some only 3, 4, and 5. Wow. I want you to imagine being one of these redcoats. You literally just watched nearly everyone around you fall on the ground, dead or wounded. Everywhere you look, hot red blood seeps out of your friends' bodies and onto their now even redder uniforms. The lucky ones, arguably, are the dead. The wounded scream in agony as they desperately hold their own torn flesh in place. Meanwhile, you and other survivors fall back for a second time. General Howe is utterly shocked, embarrassed, pissed off. The bodies of these dead British soldiers, his soldiers, now litter the tall grass between him and Breed's Hill. How could this happen? The general only arrived in New England a month ago, but he's no stranger to the Americas. A veteran of the 7 Years' War, General Howe is a champ on all things needed today. Amphibious warfare? He's your guy. So you'd think rowing across the Charles River from Boston to the Charlestown Peninsula with a sizable army to chase off the rebels fortified on Breed's and Bunker Hill would prove easy. Commanding light infantry? Again, he's your man. As for handling Americans, the dude's a veteran of the French and Indian War. You know, the American aspect of the 7 Years' War. On paper, he should be perfect for this. Instead, he's surrounded by failure. Beyond his regular troops, literally everyone in his personal staff is wounded or dead. Every single one. Even his wine didn't survive. A colonial shot shatters the bottle while in his servant's hands. How the general managed to survive unscathed is a mystery of God. So what to do? Stand down? No. The shame of the British Army losing to these colonials is far too much to bear. Aided by reinforcements just arriving from Boston, the 46-year-old, 6-foot-tall, handsome general with dark eyes prepares to make a third assault. And his men are eager. I'm sure their pride is wounded too. Their war cries of push on, and fight, conquer, or die are heard amid the shots of British cannon. This time, they march in spaced out deep columns to give the Patriots less of a target. Back in the redoubt, William Prescott and his men are nearly out of ammo. Some Patriot militia in this battle have even resorted to loading shards of glass and rusty nails down their barrels for want of ball. They again hold their shot as long as they dare. This time, they wait until the advancing British troops are within 15 to 20 yards, and then... But that's the last Patriot volley. They literally don't have the ammo for another. As William put it, their ammo went out like a candle. So this time, they can't repulse the Redcoats. British troops swarm into the Patriots' fortifications. William's men grab their muskets by the barrel and use them as clubs. They throw rocks, but these desperate, brave defenses are nothing for the Redcoats, who are armed with bayonets. The dead stack up so quickly their bodies impede movement. Angry British troops seeking revenge for their own dead impale some while dashing out the brains of others. The survivors, including our colonel, William, who parries bayonet thrusts with a sword as they retreat, manage to get out alive as the village of Charlestown below the hills burns to ashes. Roughly 10 miles south of the fighting, a 7-year-old child stands with his mother on a hill in Braintree, Massachusetts. Even from there, the boy later recalled, quote, I saw with mine own eyes those fires and heard Britannia's thunders in the Battle of Bunker's Hill, and witnessed the tears of my mother and mingled with them my own. This memory forever psychologically scars the child, the future 6th President of the United States, John Quincy Adams. His mother, of course, is herself a future First Lady. I guess I'm saying that between this child and his mother, there's a lot of leadership on that hill. 2 leaders who will not forget today. The British win the battle. They cause roughly 400 casualties to the Americans. They also kill Dr. Joseph Warren. Do you remember him? He's the Bostonian who sent William Dawes and Paul Revere on their midnight ride in episode 5. More recently, the doc had also received the rank of Major General. In fact, General Howe is utterly shocked when he learns Dr. Warren numbers among the dead, and he responds by paying the deceased patriot a high compliment. Quote, this victim was worth 500 of their men. Clearly, this is a serious loss for the Patriots. But the British pay dearly for this technical victory. General Gage reports that, quote, the loss we have sustained is greater than we can bear. No joke. You ready for this? Their casualties are more than double that of the Americans. Over 1,000. That's nearly 50% of the roughly 2,200 or so redcoats that were in this battle. The British have lost some high-level brass, too. 92 of those casualties were officers, including a now dead Major Pitcairn. You might remember the Major. He's the guy who brandished his sword at Lexington 2 months ago. A number of patriots are claimed as the killer, and none can be proven, but 2 of the most likely candidates are Salem Poor and Peter Salem. Both are free African Americans originally born into slavery. In fact, after the battle, Colonel William Prescott and other leaders in the battle asked Congress to honor Poor. To quote them, a Negro man called Salem Poor in the late battle at Charlestown behaved like an experienced officer as well as an excellent soldier. Well, killer of the Major or not, obviously, Salem Poor rocked it at Bunker Hill. The battle also includes the American Revolution's first patriot American Indian death, Samuel Ashbaugh Jr. The son of a reverend and a member of the Mohegan tribe, Samuel fought with Connecticut's 3rd Regiment that day. Sadly, Samuel isn't only the first of many American Indians to die for the patriot cause. He's the first of many Ashbaughs. By the end of the war, his parents, Samuel Sr. and Hannah, will see 4 of their 5 sons die fighting for American independence. Whew, that was a bit intense, right? We just made it through one of the most famous battles of the American Revolution, the Battle of Bunker Hill. We are now 2 months into the American Revolutionary War. Not that its participants realize this is a revolution or a war for independence just yet. But since we're fresh off the battlefield, let's get some reprieve from the bloodletting and see what colonial America is thinking at this point. Because we need to know the thought processes that are going on both sides of the Atlantic, actually, as relations continue to deteriorate to the point of real, overt independence talk. To that end, I want to walk you through 4 important documents coming out between July 1775 and January 1776. Congress's Olive Branch Petition, its declaration of the causes and necessity of taking up arms, King George III's proclamation for suppressing rebellion and sedition, and then the famous rebel-rouser Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Once we see how being a patriot is coming to mean not just standing up for English rights, but wanting full-on independence, we'll rewind back to July 1775 and watch George Washington take control of an undisciplined American army and see how he does taking on the Redcoats through March 1776. Sound good? Here we go. The last time we were in Philly, Congress seemed to be going 2 ways at once. On the one hand, it called for a day of fasting while clearly professing loyalty to King George III. On the other, it did vote to create an army and place our favorite Virginian at its head, George Washington. Shh, don't tell Thomas Jefferson. I think he might get jealous. So how does that work? I think we should clarify what a patriot is at this point. As with any term used to identify political leanings, just like liberal or conservative today, patriot is evolving in the 1770s. At this point, many patriots see themselves as only fighting to have their rights as English subjects respected. That doesn't mean they want independence. I think that's been clear enough up until war broke out, but I want to urge you to remember that's still the case. People living in 1775 don't have our 2020 hindsight. For all they know, this is going to be an unofficial or short civil war, a family feud. Many colonial Americans are still proud to be British. In fact, even as George Washington heads out to take control of the army, he thinks he'll be home by the fall, and genuinely hopes the outcome will simply be a new and better relationship between colonial America and the king. Many of the men under his command in Massachusetts feel that way too. So in short, they do mean it when they say they are loyal to the king, but they want a new relationship and they want it enough to fight for it. Oh, and by the way, Parliament can go screw itself. Let me show you what I mean with 2 documents produced by Congress in early July. First is the Olive Branch Petition, approved on July 5th, 1775. This reflects the attitudes of the dominant and more moderate delegates in Congress, like its main author, John Dickinson. Now, let me be clear. I'm not calling John a loyalist. No way. This is the guy who wrote Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania to attack the Townshend Acts back in 1767. But like I said a minute ago, many, if not most, still do not see independence as necessary to ensure their rights as English subjects. In the petition, Congress calls for, quote, stopping the further effusion of blood and for averting the impending calamities that threaten the British Empire. In other words, let's be cool and hey, let's keep our empire together. It's a win-win. They leave the blame at the feet of people who are not the king. Addressing him, Congress is only pushing back against, quote, cruel enemies who abuse your royal confidence and authority for the purpose of effecting our destruction. Yeah, so it's not you, O king, it's those jerks in Parliament. In fact, the petition even states that Congress wants a happy and permanent reconciliation. Sounds good, right? And it's signed by all 12 of the colonies at the Congress. Because, yep, Georgia is still sitting it out. All that said, I think the document Congress authorizes the very next day, the Thomas Jefferson-driven Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms, hits the real mood of the delegates better. See, the olive branch didn't list their grievances or justify the war that has already broken out. This declaration, though? Oh, it does. Going back to the end of the 7 Years' War, it calls out the new power Parliament has tried to wield over them in the course of 11 years. It calls out the coercive acts, the Quebec Act. It quotes the Declaratory Act of 1776, in which Parliament said it can, of right, make laws to bind us in all cases whatsoever. And of course, the Declaration mentions the, quote, unprovoked assault at the town of Lexington. Now, the delegates do say, let me quote again, "We mean not to dissolve the union which has so long and so happily subsisted between us, and which we sincerely wish to see restored." You know, they are serious about this. They really would like to remain British, just under different terms. Okay, well, I'm excluding the Adams cousins when I say they would like to remain British under different terms. But on the other hand, they also state that they are of one mind resolved to die free men rather than live slaves. Now, the reality is none of this matters much for King George III. He outright refuses to give consideration to the olive branch. It's full-on rejected. So these documents don't change anything, but they do serve a purpose in giving us a better idea of what the delegates in Congress were thinking in July 1775. I think it's clear that we don't have a Congress that agrees on everything, but rather we have a spectrum of views ranging mostly from moderates who are still hoping for reconciliation to the Adams cousins who do sign the olive branch but are basically like, whatever, this reconciliation crap is a waste of time. That ship has sailed. And it did so out of a tea-filled Boston harbor. Although the king won't give the olive branch petition the light of day, the third of the 4 documents we're talking about today comes from his government. This is the Royal Proclamation of Rebellion. This is in response to the news of the battle we opened this episode with, the Battle of Bunker Hill. I mean, sure, the King's Royal Army pushed those rebel farmers with their muskets off of the Charlestown Peninsula, but over 1,000 redcoat casualties? And the rebels don't have half as many? From here on out, this August 23rd, 1775 proclamation says that, let me quote, "Not only all our officers, civil and military, are obliged to exert their utmost endeavors to suppress such rebellion, and to bring the traitors to justice, but that all our subjects of this realm and dominion thereunto belonging are bound by law to be aiding and assisting in the suppression of such rebellion." Okay then, so basically it's illegal to have friends who are patriots now. This effectively shuts down the pittance of parliamentarians or influential types in London who still want compromise and peace with the American colonies. Oh, and just so we don't mince words, the proclamation calls patriot leaders, quote, dangerous and ill-designing men. You might notice that's about how patriot leaders describe Parliament. Perspective. And of course, just in case he wasn't clear enough in this proclamation, King George III doubles down on this talk in his late October 1775 speech from the throne. He basically says the Olive Branch Petition is a lie. Let me quote him. "They meant only to amuse by vague expressions of attachment to the parent state and the strongest protestations of loyalty to me, whilst they were preparing general revolt." Ooh, ouch. Sorry, John Dickinson, that's gotta burn. Oh, but here's my favorite line, quoting again. "When the unhappy and deluded multitude against whom this force will be directed shall become sensible of their error, I shall be ready to receive the misled with tenderness and mercy." Translation, I'm sending armies to kill you, but hey, I love you. So it's into this atmosphere that the last of our 4 documents today enters the scene. Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Now, before getting into what I would call the most influential of all American revolutionary pamphlets, let me tell you a bit about Tom. English born and bred, Tom bonded with Benjamin Franklin when our favorite Pennsylvanian was repping Philly's interests across the Atlantic in London. They bonded. Ben even sent a note to his son-in-law asking him to help Tom settle in Philadelphia. So it was 1774 when a 37-year-old Tom with flowing locks and a prominent nose headed to America. Once here, he started pushing all the revolutionary buttons. He published Common Sense in early 1776. But as popular as his revolutionary pamphlet was, some of his other ideas didn't go over so well. For one thing, he contributed to the establishment of the Anti-Slavery Society. Yep, he's one of the founding fathers who believed that as America ushered in liberty, it needed to do so for all Americans. Now, as you can imagine, this view wasn't universally appreciated. He was also a deist. If you're not familiar with that term, it means he believed in a God, but didn't believe this God intervenes in our lives. So how do you explain bad things happening? Well, in this paradigm, it's simple. God doesn't intervene. Tom also had a Quaker background, but his writings show he was not a fan of Christianity. Again, that's a position that is not going to win friends in 18th century America, or Britain, or France. And speaking of France, since Tom is something of a revolution chaser, he'll later get involved in the French Revolution and nearly get himself killed over there. But that's a story for another season. Okay, now that we know that we have bonded with Tom, let's get to his January 1776 pamphlet, Common Sense. It's an enormous success. Legitimate copies sell for $1, but people are copying, sharing, listening to others read it out loud. You know, it's like I've said about other previous pamphlets. Tom's gone #colonial viral. Over 150,000 copies sell, and let me remind you, there's only 2 million plus people in the American colonies. Though in truth, his readership isn't just America. Britain's reading him too. Not to say people agree, but they read him. Hell, even the heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales, reads it. His mom catches him in the act. Oh, kids. Yeah, I really hope my biggest problem as a parent is that I'll find my kids reading intellectual trees someday. But to move beyond Britain, the French are also eating it up. Not surprising given that the pamphlet hates on the British monarchy. So why is he so successful? It's not because his attacks on the British Constitution and hereditary monarchy are new and novel. It's because he's not pretentiously using big words that go over the normal person's head. With that style, he reaches way more people. You know, common farmer types who can read and think. They're not stupid, but they aren't going to follow a bunch of specialized jargon. Let me give you an example. At one point, Tom attacks the idea of the throne being passed down from parent to child, mostly father to son, and the idea that Jesus supports this by taking a shot at the French nobleman named William, who conquered England and made himself king way back in 1066. Check this out. Tom says, and I quote, "No man in his senses can say that their claim under William the Conqueror is a very honorable one. The French bastard, landing with an armed banditti and establishing himself king of England against the consent of the natives, is in plain terms a very paltry, rascally original. It certainly hath no divinity in it." Now, just in case you think Tom has a mouth on him, William really was born the illegitimate son of a French noble and his mistress. In a technical sense, William really was a bastard. Not only does Tom avoid pretension with his word choice, he avoids it with which thinkers he uses to back up his claims. Tom doesn't cite classical philosophers in the original Latin. Nope. He cites the one book he can count on just about any American farmer knowing and loving, the Bible. He cites the good book left and right. Here's an example of him using the Bible to attack the idea of inherited thrones once more. The children of Israel being oppressed by the Midianites, Gideon marched against them with a small army, and victory, through the divine interposition, decided in his favor. The Jews, elated with success and attributing it to the generalship of Gideon, proposed making him a king, saying, "Rule thou over us, thou and thy son, and thy son's son." Here was temptation in its fullest extent, not a kingdom only, but a hereditary one. But Gideon, in the piety of his soul, replied, "I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." Words need not be more explicit. Gideon doth not decline the honor, but denieth their right to give it. Whew! See what I mean? just plain English. And your typical farmer might not know the writings of Roman thinkers like Cicero, but they sure do know the story of Gideon, or at the very least, they respect a good Bible reference. Oh, and let's point out, Tom's Quaker roots are showing through here. I mean, that's pretty decent Old Testament work for a guy who doesn't buy into an Abrahamic faith. Let's also keep in mind that Tom's publishing this on the heels of the king's rejection of the olive branch and the proclamation of rebellion. Furthermore, patriots are livid about the other military tactics being used by the crown. Mercenaries are being sent to fight in America. The royal governor of Virginia tries to start a slave rebellion to upend Southern patriots. And rumor has it, British agents are trying to enlist American Indians to fight against them too. These actions combined make the colonists identify less and less as British. And in a weakened state of British identity, Tom's common sense is a wrecking ball. His forceful, clear writing pushes more patriot Americans to think reconciliation really is a pipe dream. Hell, Tom even impacts George Washington, and profoundly so. By the end of January 1776, George is acknowledging that maybe this isn't just a civil war. Maybe this is a move for independence. Okay, I think you've got the importance of these 4 documents, right? And you can see how things are evolving intellectually across 1775 and into early 1776. Patriots are steadily shifting from the view that this is a civil war, but we're all still British and will remain so, to the view that King George III doesn't give a damn about us and we have to go all the way. It's time for independence. That view's going to keep simmering. And we'll get a declaration to that effect in July 1776. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm sure we're all happy to have made it to 1776. This'll be a crazy year. But we need to know what's been going on with George Washington since he took command of the American army camped outside of Boston in July 1775. So let's go back a half a year or more and see what's up with George. Time to rewind. When we last hung out with George Washington in episode 6, Congress had just voted to make the delegate and colonel from Virginia commander-in-chief of all the Continental forces. It did so on June 15th, 1775. George then gave his super humble acceptance speech the following day on June 16th. That speech was the day before the Battle of Bunker Hill. Given the lack of cars, trains, and planes, I'm sure you can see why George didn't make an appearance at the battle. In fact, he didn't even know about it. George leaves Philly on June 23rd, and it's only when he gets to New York that he hears about the Battle of Bunker Hill. He finally arrives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is just outside of Redcoat-occupied Boston, on July 2nd. He formally takes command the next day, on July 3rd. Now, you and I might think, wow, George Washington. I bet everyone was awestruck. And legend would have you believe that too. Among the many myths surrounding George is the claim that he gloriously took command of the Continental Army under a specific elm tree in the Cambridge Common. Alas, no. But as the legend became fact in the minds of Americans, you can see how sacred this tree became. That tree, known as the Washington Elm, died in 1923. At that point, the powers that be cut it into small pieces and gave them to important organizations around the country. Although likely not under the Washington Elm, George does take control of the army on July 3rd. And there is some military splendor involved. Lieutenant Hodgkins counts 21 drummers and, to quote him, as many fifers, beating and playing round the parade ground. But that said, let's not picture all 15,000 or so troops at attention or even caring. I mean, Private Samuel Hawes either manages not to notice George's arrival between July 2nd and 3rd, or he just does not care. To quote his journal, July 1st, nothing remarkable this day. 2nd, ditto. 3rd, ditto. Yup. Samuel describes the day George Washington arrives in Cambridge and the next day when he took command as ditto for nothing remarkable. Wow. Truth is, many of these soldiers likely aren't too jazzed to have George here. This is really a New England army, and now this newly formed Second Continental Congress is forcing the Yankees to answer to a Southerner? Let those regionalisms sink in a bit. But you know what? The feeling is kind of mutual. George describes these ill-disciplined soldiers as, and I quote the founding father, an exceedingly dirty and nasty people. Now, if you're thinking, whoa, George, that is harsh, let me tell you a bit about the army he just inherited. Many treat orders like suggestions. They lack general discipline. They lack general hygiene, both because many of the men see washing their clothes as women's work and so don't care to do it, and because they haven't bothered to dig enough latrines. So just think of that odor. All supplies, from food to ammo to medicine, tools, tents, money, and more, are low. And defensive measures to protect them, should the Royal Army attack, are an absolute joke. But just to really drive the point home, here's an observation from one of His Majesty's surgeons. Now, to be fair, this is a British perspective, but it's not without value. After all, George's description just a minute ago wasn't exactly kind. Writing in May 1775, here's what the surgeon has to say about their drinking habits. Quote, "Without New England rum, a New England army could not be kept together. They could neither fight nor say their prayers one with another. They drink at least a bottle of it a man a day." In other words, stereotypical frat boys couldn't keep up with the army's drinking habits. As for his view of the army as a whole, quote, "This army is truly nothing but a drunken, canting, lying, praying, hypocritical rabble without order, subjection, discipline, or cleanliness, and must fall to pieces of itself in the course of 3 months, notwithstanding every endeavor of their leaders." Yup, this is the army our Southern general has to work with in taking on the most formidable military on the planet. Even if this surgeon is only half right, good friggin' luck, George. Well, George gets right to it. Right off the bat, he sets up his home and headquarters in the abandoned mansion of loyalist John Vassall. Oh, and it's a beautiful place, by the way. The later home of the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. If you're ever in Cambridge, you have to check it out. Anyhow, about 3 weeks after arriving in Cambridge, George writes his brother, John, describing his work at disciplining troops and preparing defenses. Quote, "I find a mixed multitude of people here, under very little discipline, order, or government. My whole time since I came here has been employed in throwing up lines of defense." Maybe his hard work's paying off. By late July 1775, our old friend from Concord, the Reverend William Emerson, has a fairly different description from that of the British surgeon. He writes, to quote, "Generals Washington and Lee are upon the lines every day. New orders from His Excellency are read to the respective regiments every morning after prayers. The strictest government is taking place, and great distinction is made between officers and soldiers. Everyone is made to know his place and keep it. It is surprising how much work has been done." If you're pulling for the Patriots, don't get too excited by the Reverend's description. George's sad excuse for an army is still nothing compared to the British. He's just moving them in the right direction. But he's also winning them over. Southerner or not, people are falling for George. Remember, as I said in the last episode, he is charming as hell. Not in a sleazy way either. He's just genuinely likable. Here are some contemporary descriptions. "Discreet and virtuous, no harum-starum, ranting, swearing fellow, but sober, steady, and calm." Another one. "No pretensions to eloquence, solid judgment and information." Meanwhile, Abigail Adams compares George to the biblical king whose wisdom had no match, King Solomon. She feels as blown away in meeting the general as the Queen of Sheba did when meeting the Israeli king. Just as the Queen of Sheba exclaimed, "The hath was not told me, thy wisdom and prosperity exceedeth the fame which I heard," so writes Abigail to her husband John, quote, "I was struck with George Washington. You had prepared me to entertain a favorable opinion of him, but I thought the one half was not told me. Dignity with ease and complacency, the gentleman and soldier looks agreeably blended in him." Damn, George. How does he do it? Well, first, remember, we already saw these traits when we met him in episode 1. The guy inspires confidence. He's a natural leader. People love him. Standing over 6 foot in his immaculate uniform, George looks the part. But he also does the right thing, too. Although a man of hierarchy and order who believes troops and commanders need to avoid familiarity, George is constantly in camp. He suffers with those under his command. And despite the description of this New England army as drunks, let's be clear, most New Englanders know how to work. They respect a strong work ethic and a leader who doesn't waste. George rocks it on both accounts. So New Englanders might be a bit more free-spirited and independent than George likes in a military context, but make no mistake, the Congress-imposed Southerner is winning over all of these Yankees. Now, we're keeping the focus on George, but as we get late into 1775, we should make a quick note about British leadership changes and an American failure this winter up in Canada. So first, the British. You remember General/Massachusetts Governor Gage, right? Well, he's removed from his role as commander of British forces in America. Although the Battle of Bunker Hill back in June proved a technical victory, the cost was too high, and this doesn't reflect well on Gage. He receives orders to pack it up and head back to England in September. The man left in charge is the general we met on the ground at Bunker Hill, William Howe. Like I said before, standing at 6 foot, he's a tall guy for the era. His bravery is unmatched. Despite being a general, Howe marched right at the front with his men at Bunker Hill. But while he's crazy brave on the battlefield, he can be quite the procrastinator off of it. Also, he's a man of pleasure. Word is that in Boston, he's having a relationship with a married woman, Elizabeth Lloyd Loring, with her husband's blessing. As for the American failure up in Canada, this happens in the dead of winter. Congress has given the okay for an invasion into Canada with a mind to curry favor with the French. There are 2 American armies, one led by Benedict Arnold, the other by General Richard Montgomery. With their men's enlistments expiring at the end of the year, these 2 decide to attack Quebec on December 31st, 1775. They botch it. Of the 800 to 900 men, roughly 400 are killed or taken captive. Numbering among the dead is General Montgomery, mowed down with several others by grape shot that hits him in the thigh and neck at 5 a.m. in the morning. According to one account, a young officer named Aaron Burr tries to recover the commander's body. Quote, Burr returned back alone and attempted, amidst a shower of musketry, to bring on his shoulder the body of Montgomery. But the general, being a large man and Burr small, and the snow deep, prevented him. We'll never know for sure if this is true, but at least if you're a fan of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton musical, you now better understand that line sung by Aaron Burr. I was a captain under General Montgomery until he caught a bullet in the neck in Quebec. And well, in summary. A final point on this disaster in Canada. Let's add that Montgomery was well known and respected by all, both his enemies and his men. Patriot leaders like George Washington are devastated to learn of his death. Despite the failure and the way in which this weakens the Patriots' position, the deceased general and the injured Benedict Arnold are seen as heroes. You know another odd thing? If the health of the general and future father-in-law of Alexander Hamilton, Philip Schuyler, had been better, he would have been the one leading this invasion. Man, I can't even begin to speculate on how that could have changed the trajectory, potentially, of Alexander or Aaron. There is just too much there. Okay, returning to our story in Massachusetts, General Montgomery and Benedict Arnold aren't the only ones in late December worrying about their men's expiring enlistments. George Washington has the same problem. Many of his men have no interest in re-enlisting either. Their attitude is basically, hey, we've done our part. Let some other dudes step in and do theirs. George is desperately trying to get guys to re-enlist. According to Connecticut soldier Simeon Lyman, General Charles Lee, who is second in command to George, more or less tries to bully him into re-enlisting. He wrote, quote, General Lee came in and the first words was, "Men, I do not know what to call you. You are the worst of all creatures," and flung and cursed and swore at us and said if we would not stay, he would order us to go on Bunker Hill, and if we would not go, he would order the riflemen to fire at us. By the way, now that you've gotten a taste of Charles Lee, it might not surprise you to know that American Indians like to call him boiling water. George is dogged trying to make it look like he actually has enough men to man his defenses. He's afraid the British will realize how weak they are and take him on. And to a degree, they do know. When George raises the first continental flag with its 13 stripes on January 1st, 1776, it's been said that the Redcoats thought it was a flag of surrender. Despite these challenges, George starts to bounce back. Half of the 7,000 soldiers whose enlistments expire in January 1776 do re-enlist. Meanwhile, new faces show up. Some of these newbies are Southerners, which helps make this less a New Englander venture and more an actual Continental Army. Further, the desperate need for more troops pushes George to reconsider an earlier order denying African Americans the ability to enlist in the Army. I'm not surprised by his original order. Born in Virginia to a slave-owning family and now owning a plantation which came to him through his deceased half-brother, Lawrence, George's attitude is about what one could expect from a human being with such a background. So even if we can't understand the context that would create such prejudice in George, it is of course lamentable that he would exclude good Americans like Samuel Poor, who he met at Bunker Hill, from joining up because they're black. But as the Army's ranks grow thin and many free blacks continue to make known their desire to fight, George reverses the order. African Americans will continue to sacrifice their blood and lives for the future of the American Republic. And so, things are looking better for George as we go into January 1776. He's still short on much needed supplies, but at least his head count is up. At this point, in January 1776, we have a stalemate. General Howe and his maybe 7,000 to 8,000 men are hunkered down in Boston. They've, of course, fortified the Boston Neck, which is the only land route by which George could attack them. Howe still controls Bunker Hill, too, which is on the Charlestown Peninsula to the north. At the same time, though, Howe is trapped in Boston. His army's skill is superior, but they are half the number of George's and have to wait on supplies from shipments. In fact, they are burning through Boston's supplies and cutting down trees to burn as fuel. Howe's men even cut down the Patriots' beloved Liberty Tree, which you might remember me mentioning in a few previous episodes. So Howe and George are at an impasse. There's only one move that could break this situation: if someone seizes Dorchester Heights. Dorchester Heights is basically the one other place besides Bunker Hill from which George could threaten Howe, especially his ships in Boston Harbor. Both George and Howe know this. It's on the south side of Boston's peninsula. It's kind of like a geographical mirror image of Bunker Hill's position across the Charles River on the north side of Boston. Howe, who again is a procrastinator off the battlefield, hasn't moved on it, and George wants to. The problem is, he lacks the necessary artillery to actually threaten Howe if he did take it. I mean, what good is holding the hills of Dorchester Heights if George can't actually bombard the Redcoats, or even defend his position if General Howe then decides to push him off of it? You see the dilemma? Things change, though, when Henry Knox shows up with a hell of a lot of cannon. Let me introduce you to Henry. He's a Boston-born 25-year-old known for being the life of the party. He's a big dude for the era, over 6 foot tall and weighing in around 250 pounds. But don't let his jovial nature or size fool you. He's brawn and brains. Henry's been hustling and working to help support his mom and family since his dad disappeared in the West Indies when he was 9 years old. Eventually, he opened a bookstore in Boston, called London Bookstore, with all the latest and greatest from the empire's capital. He did okay for himself, and his shop became a hangout for British officers as well as the loyalist ladies. Henry had no experience as a soldier before the war broke out, but he was an avid reader, including books on military science. So, fast forward to today. Henry's rocked it at the Battle of Bunker Hill, he's been made a colonel, and he and George are getting along just fine. So what's up with the cannons? Where did it magically come from? Well, do you remember when I mentioned Fort Ticonderoga in the last episode? I don't blame you if you don't. It was a quick comment, but this is the same New York fort that Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen seized the same day the Second Continental Congress met for the first time back in May 1775. That fort had plenty of cannons, and now Henry's bringing it all to Boston to lay the smackdown on General Howe. It's no small task. He sets out from Cambridge on November 16th and arrives at the fort on December 5th. On the return trip, he mentions in his journal his frustration with General Schuyler's, quote, careless manner that allows one of the heaviest cannon to fall into the river at Half Moon Ferry. But never fear, with the help of some of the locals from nearby Albany, they managed to recover the cannon. In their honor, a grateful Henry names the cannon the Albany. All told, Henry and his crew moved these massive guns, a few of which weighed more than 5,000 pounds, over 300 miles of ice, snow, and water. By late January, he's dragged 43 cannons and 14 mortars all the way from this New York fort to Framingham, Massachusetts, which is about 20 miles outside of Cambridge. Over the following month, these awesome pieces of artillery are placed on George's lines. And with these new toys, George's Council of War finally agreed to move against General Howe. Time to take Dorchester Heights and scare the hell out of some redcoats. So here's the plan. George knows he needs to start and finish taking Dorchester Heights under the cover of night. It's the only way General Howe doesn't come up and stop him. But how can George's men do that? How do you set up fortifications for so many cannon in one night when you can't dig in the frozen ground? Inspiration comes from Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Putnam's reading of a book called Muller's Field Engineer. They're going to fabricate their fortifications. George's men will fabricate their fortifications off-site, then move them up the steep hills at night, putting everything in place before the morning dawn. It's prefab at its finest. Ingenious, and not bad for a pre-industrialized society. George's men spend the next few weeks building wooden frames to fill up with hay and bundles of sticks. George has them fill barrels with dirt. If General Howe's men try to charge up the hill, these things are going to be rolled down on his troops. Yup. Bet you didn't realize George knew what an effective weapon a rolling barrel could be 2 centuries before Donkey Kong came on the scene, did you? In all seriousness, once the Patriots take this hill, it could unleash a bloodbath. Preparations are made at the hospital in Cambridge to treat thousands of soldiers in anticipation. A nervous George calms his mind writing letters. Among those he writes is the African-American poet Phillis Wheatley, who has recently written a poem for George. Okay, this Virginian's ready to break a stalemate. It's the night of March 4th, 1776. Thousands of George's men, under several commanders, are on the move, fulfilling their various roles in the dark of night. Under General Thomas, some 2,000 men head out to install the prefabbed fortifications and the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga. They move their tools, guns, 700 to 800 bundles of sticks, wooden frames, barrels, and other supplies up the steep hills of Dorchester Heights with the assistance of over 300 ox carts. Meanwhile, other cannon bombard Boston Neck. It's not meant to actually do any harm. George just wants the redcoats distracted, and it works. General Howe's forces return fire. No major damage is done by either side. All they really do is make noise for the most part, which is perfect. It helps Thomas's men, who are fortifying Dorchester Heights in near complete silence, to go unnoticed, or at least unnoticed enough. According to Reverend William Gordon, quote, General Thomas told me that by 10 o'clock at night, they had 2 forts, one upon each hill, sufficient to defend them from small arms and grape shot. Can you picture them? Trying to say hardly a word, placing the wooden frames on the hard frozen ground, seeing their own breaths every time they exhale, the biting cold making each movement difficult as they move wood, hay, and dirt in place, and as they pull cannon into position. By 3 a.m., Thomas's exhausted men are done. They go to rest as a fresh 3,000 troops replace them on the hill. At the same time, Generals Sullivan and Greene have another 4,000 troops standing ready in the Cambridge Common. They're waiting for the signal from the Roxbury Church steeple. Once they see it, they'll know General Howe has attacked Dorchester Heights, leaving Boston's fortifications weakened. When that happens, they'll head to the boats and launch an amphibious attack on the city. As morning breaks, General Howe and his men are absolutely stunned, shocked, floored. George's men have taken the hills of Dorchester Heights and heavily reinforced them with parapets and cannon all while they slept. Cannon that make his position in Boston no longer tenable. The Reverend William Gordon reports, quote, General Howe was seen to scratch his head and heard to say by those that were about him that he did not know what he should do, that the provincials had done more work in one night than his whole army would have done in 6 months. London papers later printed an account of an officer of distinction that described the siege that morning. Quote, This morning at daybreak we discovered 2 redoubts on the hill of Dorchester Point. They were all raised during the night, with an expedition equal to that of the genie belonging to Aladdin's wonderful lamp. From these hills they commanded the whole town, so that we must drive them from their post or desert the place. Wow, the Patriots had done all this in one night, the same night the British generals had spent drinking. In response, British cannons opened fire on the Patriot-held hills of Dorchester Heights. It's of no use. The Patriots are too high and out of range. Admiral Molinus Schuldham informs General Howe their entire fleet at Boston now sits in range of George's cannon and must move with all haste. As his cannons continue to have no effect, General Howe knows he must do something else. He prepares his soldiers to attack. Some are terrified. They remember Bunker Hill, and this is the same setup, but far worse. They fear they go like sheep to the slaughter. Others are excited. They talk of how they will punish the rebels. Massachusetts civilians take to the hills, ready to watch the bloody slaughter. As morning moves on, Boston's Long Wharf teems with thousands of redcoats preparing to ship out. General Howe plans to attack when night falls. At some point in all of this, George Washington makes his way up to Dorchester Heights. I picture him in his immaculate uniform looking down on the pandemonium of the redcoats far below in Boston. Everything he's planned has gone like clockwork. His parapets in place, the cannon prepared, barrels ready to roll. If General Howe does come at them, this battle will be bloody. It will be deadly, but it will be on George's terms. According to the Reverend Gordon, George calls out to those within the sound of his voice, Remember it is the 5th of March, and avenge the death of your brethren. The more distant men ask what the general said, and word gets around. It's the 5th of March. Let's get revenge. Revenge for whom, you might ask? Revenge for Samuel Gray. Revenge for James Caldwell. Samuel Maverick, Patrick Carr, Crispus Attucks. Because today, March 5th, 1776, marks 6 years exactly since Captain Preston's men killed them in the Boston Massacre. George's words, the Reverend says, are like fresh fuel to the martial fire before kindled. As an increasingly harder wind pushes southeast, George's men are eager and ready to fight. Muskets and cannon ready, impatiently they wait. Much like you, because thank you for listening, History That Doesn't Suck is a bi-weekly podcast, and we will pick up with what happened here in 2 weeks. Now, if you've enjoyed listening, I would encourage you to please subscribe so that you do not miss future episodes. And if you'd like to connect with me or some of the other fans, by all means, follow on Instagram, go to the Facebook group, and just search for History That Doesn't Suck. And by the way, if you'd like to help me keep History That Doesn't Suck going, be sure to share this with your friends, family, whoever, and consider a Patreon subscription. Even $1 or $2 helps things go. You can find me at patreon.com/History That Doesn't Suck. Now, by the way, next time is huge. So here's a grape shot of what's coming. We're going to figure out what happens at Dorchester Heights. We're declaring independence. Then we're going to see what's going down in New York, including a cannon stealing Alexander Hamilton and the legendary Stoic execution of Nathan Hale. Oh, and George is going to wish some Hessian mercenaries a Merry Christmas they will not forget. Join me 2 weeks from now in episode 8, where I'd like to tell you a story.